At 2:17 a.m., three men wearing fake HOA uniforms cut through my ranch fence and drove away laughing. They thought they were clearing land for their luxury event. What they didn't know was that the fence was the only thing holding back 80 Longhorns from the exact place they were celebrating. Quick question before we continue. What country are you watching HOA Breakpoint from? Let me know in the comments. If you're enjoying these stories, take a second to subscribe. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. My name is Cole Bennett, and I own a 240-acre cattle ranch just outside a rapidly growing Texas community called Red Creek. My grandfather bought the property decades ago, long before expensive houses, gated entrances, and private community signs started appearing around us. For years, my ranch was simple: open pasture, old oak trees, a weathered barn, and longhorn cattle that had been bred on our land for generations. Then the HOA arrived. A luxury development called Silver Ridge Estates was built along the eastern edge of my property. At first, they wanted nothing to do with my ranch. Then their president, Victoria Harrington, started sending letters. The fence was visually inconsistent. The cattle were incompatible with the community aesthetic. The ranch road was an eyesore. I ignored most of it because none of their rules applied to my property. But Victoria wasn't used to hearing no. And that became important later. Because 3 weeks before the incident, she made one strange statement during a neighborhood meeting. She said, "Once the old fence comes down, everything will finally look beautiful." At the time, I thought she was talking about replacing a section of the HOA's own fencing. I was wrong. Very wrong. One Thursday night, I locked the ranch gates at 9:30 p.m. Everything was normal. By sunrise, nearly 600 feet of my western boundary fence was gone. Not damaged. Not broken. Gone. The posts had been cut cleanly at ground level. And sitting in the dirt were fresh tire tracks from a heavy utility vehicle. But that wasn't the strangest part. There was also a small metal sign lying in the grass. It read, "Property Improvement Authorized by HOA." Security. I stared at it for several seconds. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was so ridiculous I couldn't believe someone had actually done it. My ranch wasn't part of Silver Ridge Estates. It wasn't governed by their HOA, and nobody had permission to touch my fence. I called the county sheriff. But before the deputy arrived, something else caught my attention. My cattle were standing at the far end of the pasture. All 80 of them. And they were staring directly toward the missing fence. That was when I realized exactly what the HOA had accidentally done. They hadn't just removed a fence, they had opened a gate-sized hole into the pasture. And 80 Longhorns had a straight path toward the development. I immediately moved the cattle into another pasture. But I didn't repair the fence yet. I wanted to know who had done it, and I wanted proof. The deputy arrived around 8 a.m. He photographed the tire tracks, the cut posts, and the metal sign. Then he asked me a question that changed everything. "Do you recognize these men?" He showed me a security camera still from a neighboring property. 3 men, black shirts, reflective vests, and a large HOA logo printed across their chests. I didn't recognize them, but Victoria Harrington did. When I called her, she didn't sound surprised. She sounded annoyed. She told me the patrol had been hired to resolve a long-standing boundary issue. I asked her for the name of the company. Silence. Then she hung up. That was my first real warning. The second came that afternoon. A giant white tent had appeared beside the Silver Ridge clubhouse. Luxury cars were arriving, caterers were setting up tables, security barriers were being installed, and a massive banner stretched across the entrance. The Silver Ridge Founders Gala. Apparently, the HOA was hosting a private luxury event that weekend. Hundreds of guests were expected: executives, investors, local developers, even several county officials. And the event entrance was less than half a mile from the fence they had just removed. Now remember the missing fence, because that detail becomes very important. That evening I drove past the event site. Victoria was standing near the entrance, speaking with a group of men in suits. When she saw me, her expression changed. She walked over and said, "You really should have moved those animals somewhere else." I asked her what she meant. She smiled. Then she said something I'll never forget. Tomorrow morning, this entire area is going to look very different. She walked away before I could respond. That sentence kept bothering me. So I checked every camera around my ranch. And eventually, I found what I was looking for. The fake HOA patrol hadn't randomly chosen my fence. They had followed a survey map. A map showing the exact section of my property that the HOA wanted access to. Then I found something even worse. The men had returned the previous night. This time, they were carrying measuring equipment. They were preparing to create a temporary access road through my pasture. For the luxury event. They weren't just removing my fence. They were trying to make it look like my land was already part of their development. And then I discovered why. Silver Ridge Estates had an expansion proposal pending with the county. Their planned second phase required access through the same strip of land. My fence was physically blocking their plan. So they decided to remove it themselves. But they had made one enormous mistake. They didn't understand Longhorns. At 11:40 p.m., I received a message from one of my ranch hands. He had spotted the fake patrol again. This time, they were moving barricades near the event entrance. I checked the weather. Heavy morning fog was expected. Visibility would be terrible, and my cattle had been restless all night. I could have repaired the fence immediately. But I didn't. Instead, I called the sheriff and sent him every piece of evidence I had. Then I waited, because I knew something they didn't. The cattle had learned that the western pasture was open, and cattle remember where they can go. At 5:48 the next morning, the first Longhorn stepped through the opening. Then another, then 5, then 20. Within minutes, all 80 were moving toward the same direction. The luxury event was scheduled to begin at 8 a.m. At 6:12, the first guests started arriving. They had no idea what was coming. Black SUVs rolled down the private entrance. Valets opened doors. Caterers carried trays of expensive food. A string quartet began playing beneath the giant white tent. And then someone screamed. At first, everyone looked toward the road. A single Longhorn was standing in the middle of the entrance. Then another appeared behind it. Then another. And suddenly the fog began filling with horns. Dozens of them. Huge Texas Longhorns moving steadily toward the luxury event. The security guards panicked. Guests started backing away. One man dropped an entire tray of champagne glasses. Then the herd reached the barricade. It collapsed instantly. The Longhorns didn't charge the guests. They simply followed the open path. The path the HOA had created. Within minutes, 80 Longhorns were wandering through the exact event area Victoria had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars preparing. Tables overturned. Decorations disappeared beneath hooves. The giant Founders Gala banner came crashing down. And the same people who had called my ranch an eyesore were now desperately climbing onto luxury vehicles to escape a herd of cattle. But the biggest surprise hadn't happened yet. Because while everyone was watching the Longhorns, sheriff's deputies arrived. And they weren't there because of the cattle. They were there because of the evidence I had sent them. The deputies arrested the 3 men responsible for removing my fence. Their uniforms were fake, their company wasn't licensed to perform security work, and the HOA had no legal authority over my ranch. Then investigators found Victoria's messages authorizing the fence removal. One message simply said, "Take it down tonight. We need the access before Saturday." That sentence became the centerpiece of the investigation. The county immediately suspended the HOA's expansion application, the security company lost its license, and Victoria Harrington resigned before the next board meeting. As for my fence, it was rebuilt within 48 hours, stronger than before, with cameras, seal posts, and one very important sign, "Private ranch, no HOA authority." The luxury event was canceled. The expansion plan disappeared, and Silver Ridge Estates suddenly became very quiet. But there's one final detail that still makes me laugh. 3 months later, the HOA sent me a letter asking whether I would consider selling them that strip of land. I said no. Because by then they finally understood something they should have understood from the beginning. You can build a luxury neighborhood beside a ranch. You can hire fake patrols. You can remove someone else's fence. But you can't control what happens when you open the gate. Especially when 80 Longhorns are waiting on the other side.